This is Fiona Gibbs in conversation with Leo Black on the 15th of September 2014. Where were you born?
I was born in London and spent the war years in Amersham, Buckinghamshire. Then my father got a job in Cheltenham, training returned soldiers as teachers. It was known as an emergency training college, and the idea was to process them as quickly as possible into teachers, and I think it probably worked. And then, by then, he was rather old for a regular job as a senior maths master. So he spent a slightly demeaning few years trailing around parts of the Midlands doing filling-in jobs, which was not very nice. We didn't see a lot of him. I went to Oxford from 50 onwards and read the music course. I then stayed on for a couple of years and did a composition course, though it didn't lead to a career as a composer. Then there was the thorny problem of what on earth to do with all that qualification, and for the moment I got a job with Universal Edition, the Viennese publisher, whose British director, Dr. Kalmus, was a wonderful man, and I went for an interview with him and was asked, "Sprechen Sie Deutsch?" To which I blithely replied, "Oui," despite which I got the attachment and went out there and had a quite eventful time in Vienna, and then came back, worked for them for a year, and was then suddenly picked up by the scruff of the neck and drafted into the BBC. Total surprise, but I stayed there for 28 years and did quite well. It was all to the good.
Was it during your childhood in Amersham that you became interested in music?
Yes, certainly. I was intrigued by the piano. I heard it played extremely well from the age of, no age at all. Started having piano lessons when I was 6. Learnt the basic rudiments of music. Went on to be an aspiring composer till about the end of student years, when I rather ran out of music to compose.
Did you play anything as well as the piano?
I played the piano. I had organ lessons for a while, but they didn't come to anything. I never got quite the hang of coordinating the feet and the hand. Quite a good pianist. Won a prize for the best grade 8 in Gloucestershire. And kept up the piano for a long, long time. Then I married a cellist who was star pupil of Janus Starker and realised what the standard really was. And after that it got a bit more fitful. But it's something I still aspire to do.
And do you still play today?
I just play a little, yes.
And what was it that you focused on while you were at Oxford?
The course was a good mixture of harmony and counterpoint and history, and I had some quite interesting teachers in both disciplines. Edmund Rubber took me for a couple of years in harmony and counterpoint, and that finally led to a book about him, his symphonies. And there were a variety of people trying to teach me history, notably Egon Welles, who didn't really teach me very much, but he's a very nice man. So the first Viennese school was certainly my special period, and that has stayed with me for a long, long time. And I don't know whether it has any direct influence on my subsequent interest in the second Viennese school. Probably not. Because their methods and aims were so different.
Was it whilst you were at Oxford that you became particularly interested in the composer Schmidt?
No. In fact, Franz Schmidt had to wait until I was in Vienna. I went to a concert given by Paul Wittgenstein, the famous or infamous one-armed pianist who'd lost his right arm in the First World War. By then he was at a stage when he really, I think his main aim was to make as much noise with one hand as he could, as others could with two. And he played the Schmidt A major quintet, which is a very late piece and a very beautiful piece, in a way which totally put me off it. I thought this must have been Fritz Kreisler's harmony teacher, and at a certain point in the one of the slow movements, I thought, my God, if they take a wrong turning here, we'll all be sitting here next morning. Anyway, they didn't take a wrong turn, but it wasn't an encouraging introduction to Schmidt. What was that a little bit later, I went down with a mystery illness, was carted off to one of the better hospitals in Vienna, and there, on the Austrian radio, at least once a day, one heard a very luscious piece of string music, rather like the Mantovani arrangement, which was in fact the Schmidt Intermezzo from Notre Dame, his first opera, which is written to personify the glamorous gypsy girl Esmeralda. And I heard this so often that I thought, well, this is certainly something I've got to look into when I get out. And when I came to London, there in the Universal cupboard was the Vienna Symphony Orchestra's record of its Fourth Symphony, which is an absolute masterpiece, and that really got me started on Schmidt. But it was a funny way into him.
Was it while you were at Oxford that you became interested in producing? No.
The summons to visit William Glock, which meant I was actually offered a job in production, came as a total surprise. I'd heard there was a reorganisation going on, but I'd no idea I might have been part of it. So when I was appointed as what they called a music assistant, because producer was reserved for drama producers, who actually had to influence the way that the participants spoke the lines, which of course we didn't, or very, very little. Production was very new to me, and I had to get the hang of it as quickly as I could, which was not very quickly. You started off probably being a presence in the box at live broadcasts when you couldn't affect anything, and then slowly production, as in the real sense of thinking up a program and influencing it and choosing the producers, the performers, and how they, up to a limited extent, how they performed. That took a long time.
What was it that you did before producing when you were at the BBC?
Well, there wasn't a lot of time before producing, but learning the ins and outs of the job, really. There were various helpful and less helpful people around to tell one how to do it. And slowly I became a producer.
And when was it that you first met Leo Wurmser?
I had met Leo Wurmser in the course of working at Universal, or I should call them Calmus, since that was the name of the English branch. He was then in charge of the BBC Midlands Light Orchestra, which involved at one point a performance of Schmidt's Beethoven Variations, which is one of the Wittgenstein pieces. It was played by Dorothy Hazelhurst, about whom I know nothing, except she was presumably a Midlands pianist. There's nothing about her on the net. For that matter, there's nothing about Leo Wurmser on the net, not one word. You can go through 10 pages on Leon Wurmser, who's a psychiatrist who's written, or psychoanalyst who's written a number of successful books. But Leo Wurmser, who is a considerable musician, absolutely nothing, which I think is scandalous. I mean, this is, yes, all the net, not just Wikipedia. Anyway, that's got that one out of the way. And what was the question?
When did you first meet him?
I first met him in Birmingham at his office when I was working for Universal, and one of my jobs there was promotion, which was trying to get people to perform the firm's catalogue. In my innocence, not knowing that he'd actually been a pupil of Schmidt, I tried to interest him in this composer called Franz Schmidt, which didn't go down that well. I also tried to interest him in the latest offering by Gilbert Winter, who was the light music king of the time. That got out of Leo the response, I feel that, I have the feeling that Gilbert rules the roost here anyway, and I don't see why I should do anything to help him. So much for that one. Anyway, he was as you can gather, he was quite thorny, but very interested in. I don't think I actually sold him anything on that visit, and that was, as I say, before I was summoned to the BBC. When I got here, very soon after, or perhaps even by the time I arrived, he was a member of the BBC Opera Unit, and he remained in that capacity for some years. One of the things that he had to do was to find a translator for Hindemith's opera Cardillac, which was going to be broadcast. And by then he had realised that I had, as Anthony Hopkins used to say, a gift of words as well as a gift of music, and he asked me to do the translation. That was interesting because he was a very hard taskmaster. Professor Edward Dent had once said to him, "Mr. Wurmser, you have the advantage of me. You learned English, I merely picked it up." And one had the feeling that Leo had definitely learned English, and to the point where he would actually use the expression chum in correcting one about something that was not possible. So he was not the easiest man to get on with, and he was certainly, he gave the impression of being rather sad and solitary. I think being thrown out of Austria hadn't helped. Also, the end of his BBC career was difficult because the story is, which I heard from Hans Keller and have no direct confirmation, of which I have no direct confirmation, is that William Glock, as part of his reorganisation, offered Leo Wurmser a better position within the opera unit. It might even have been the chief assistant, I don't know. And then found himself not able to come up to his promise, which gave Hans Keller reason to say, long after Leo had died, "We are dancing on his grave," which suggested it was something a fairly serious disappointment. And the one thing that brightened up the end of a pretty disappointing life, really, was that he had a marvellous secretary for his last few years. She was a very vigorous lady called Jan Seddon, who really looked after him and couldn't do too much for him. And she later married the transcription music organiser Jimmy Burnett, who was equally vigorous and energetic, and finally went on to be an artist manager for Harold Holt. So she did very well and thoroughly deserved it. And I'm sure that she did all she could to brighten up Leo's final years.
How many years was Leo at the BBC?
It would have been about 5, I think. I don't know, because I don't know exactly when he joined. I say he was possibly there when I arrived, and I don't know when he was born or when he died. I know he was a pupil of Franz Schmidt in Vienna. What I didn't know until very recently, until I read Jutta Raab Hansen's book on the Hitler exiles, was that Leo was actually a cellist. That I had no idea of. I'd thought, well, he was a pupil of Schmidt. He either studied the piano with him, or he studied composition with him. But that he was a cellist, I had no idea. And with my own intimate relation to the cello nowadays, that interests me very much.
And did he ever speak about his time whilst he was in Austria?
No, he didn't.
Never.
No, he was, I think it was a time over which to draw a sanitised sheet.
And to your knowledge, did he ever return to Vienna?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
So it was very much a closed chapter.
Yeah. And he was very active as a conductor here. I mean, there was a very strange position in the very early 1960s when there were two performances of Schmidt's masterpiece, The Book with Seven Seals. One for radio, conducted by Leo, which I'm sure was extremely good, and the other for probably something like the Camden Festival, which was going then, conducted by Brian Fairfax, whom I'd generously described as a broad brush conductor, who certainly got around the repertoire. He did some amazing premieres, like the Kurt Weill Violin Concerto, but I don't suppose that his Book with Seven Seals was quite as idiomatic as Leo's. And they both went out roughly, they were heard at roughly the same time. The Leo performance, which was broadcast and therefore could have been heard by up to about 50,000 people, received no press attention at all. The Brian Fairfax one, which had presumably been attended by a few hundred people, got a quite widespread press coverage, and I thought, well, this is the situation of radio, as distinct from anything else. It's a bywater, it's a byway, and it might even not survive. Which is when the Pilkington Committee recommended that it be expanded, I at least rejoiced, because it meant I still had a job.
When was it that you first met Paul Hamburger?
That must have been very early on in my BBC time, because he was an active accompanist. He didn't become a staff accompanist until a bit later, but for the rest of that time he was a very close and valued colleague, because he had so many opinions about everything, most of them very sound, that one overlooked anything such as a touch of heaviness in the playing sometimes, for the sake of this pure musical knowledge. And then when he left the BBC, one thing that was very good was that he had kept all his BBC contracts. He knew exactly which of his dates had been done on staff and therefore carried no repeat fees, which had been done on a contract and therefore carried a repeat fee. And he could always tell you, which was jolly good, jolly useful in costing programmes. But he was a wonderful man.
Did you have a high opinion of him as a musician?
Yes, enormously high, because he understood music. He was one of the people that Hans Keller used very irritatingly to refer to as all musicians who were there. So if anybody else's reaction didn't matter.
Did he ever speak to you about his time in Vienna?
Yes, Paul was quite outspoken in his hatred for Vienna for a long, long time. There was a Radio 4 programme in the late 70s, in which he participated, and the presenter was so incautious as to ask him, "What would you say to a young man who was off to Vienna?" "I would say, why do you want to go to that dump?" But then much later, for one reason or another, friendships and so on, and rediscovering old friends, he changed his view of Vienna totally, and he really enjoyed his last few visits. He would always send me cards saying which operetta he'd been to, and you got the impression that he'd always loved the place.
So a complete turnaround?
Complete turnaround, yes. And another turnaround at the same time was that he finally overcame his fear of flying, which of course made it possible to get to Vienna that much quicker.
And did he ever speak about his time when he was in the internment camp over here?
He didn't, but Hans Keller did. Hans had this story that Paul had been so happy in the internment camp that when time came for them to be released, he protested and insisted on staying, which was quite in character. I mean, there was another story of Hans's that for a while Paul had been absolutely addicted to chess. I mean, he was a very good chess player, could wipe the floor with me. And he used to go to the Gambit chess rooms, which were the notorious chess den in the city. And he got so addicted to it that he had to ask the management of the Gambit to ban him, because otherwise he knew he was just going to spend so much time in the Gambit chess rooms that his career would be nowhere.
Why do you think it was that he became so obsessed with chess?
I think Paul ran some risk of being obsessed with anything he got really interested in, because he had that sort of mind. He wanted to go into things deeply.
Going back to what Hans was saying, why was it that he was so happy in the internment camp?
He did write me once one of his innumerable postcards at the end. The army provided us with warm food and comfortable beds. Which was
quite simple.
quite simple.
Paul also did some producing?
Yes, yes, he was. Eleanor Warren made him, recruited him. Eleanor Warren, when head of music, recruited him as a producer. So he was. He insisted on being left free also to play, to accompany in broadcasts, and that was easily arranged with the contracts department. And yes, he was a producer for quite a long time.
Did you work quite closely with him then? Or?
No, because producers didn't work closely with each other. Producers never knew what the others were doing. They were too busy producing.
And did Paul have a large impact on your time at the BBC, or was it more working in parallel?
I think working in parallel is closer to it. But I was in and out of his office quite a lot, just as I was in and out of Hans Keller's office a lot.
When was it that you first met Hans Keller?
Well, I met Hans while working for Kalmus, because he came to the office in search of a bargain of some sort. When I came to the BBC, he was my first boss. So I met him after introductory half hour being told the rules by a wonderful man called Harry Croft Jackson. I then went down to Hans's office and was told how it really worked.
Was that before or after your interview with William Glock?
Oh, obviously after. But I'm glad you've reminded me about that. How could I forget it? Hans was also at the interview with Glock, and as I found later, he had been deputed by Glock, who treated him very much as his right-hand man in those years before they fell out, to ask around among the various progressive personalities in the musical world at the time about me and about anybody else who he was seriously interested in. And he consulted Susan Bradshaw, and as what he said to me was that her backing for the idea of me as a producer was so, how to get it right, her backing for me as the idea of a producer was so articulate and positive that he didn't need to ask anymore. He took that one back to William and reported, and the next thing that followed was the interview. So he'd already been doing his bit even before I met him, apart from the Kalmus meeting, which was purely commercial.
So obviously Hans had a large impact on the beginning of your career at the BBC. Did that continue throughout your career?
I'd say it did continue, yes. I mean, he wasn't my boss for more than a couple of years, because at that point Glock switched over the two chief assistants, so that Leonard Isaacs was my line manager. But Hans was such a powerful personality and such a good friend that I just kept in touch and would always go to him if in doubt about anything.
Did he speak to you about his time before he came to Britain?
Well, what I remember most is the famous Radio 4, or Home Service broadcast, A Time of My Life, which of course was directed to anybody who listened to Home Service, But yes, I think he did talk about it a bit. It's just that the programme has it made such a strong impact that it's what I remember.
Was this a mainly positive experience?
I think all experiences were positive for Hans. He made them positive.
So it seems that he was a positive person in general.
Enormously positive, yes.
Did he speak about the musical life of Vienna?
Oh, what he did speak about was his times eavesdropping on Franz Schmidt's chamber music sessions, which were held, I think, mostly at the home of one of his fellow professors. And it was obvious that Schmidt made an enormous impression on him as a complete musician. I never heard him refer to him as a great composer, which is something where I think I disagree with Hans. But as the total musician who could do absolutely anything, he could, as Hans put it, he could, if you mentioned a passage from a piece of musical work, he would waddle to the piano and play you a note-perfect piano transcription of the passage in question, no matter what it was. And his pianism, the man recognised as the world's greatest pianist, Leopold Godowsky, was once asked, who is the world's greatest pianist? And instead of just saying me, he said, the other is Franz Schmidt. So that's an accolade. As a cellist, there's a very curious clash of evidence here, because Hans, who must have been, I suppose, 15, perhaps when he went to the Schmidt sessions, by which time Schmidt was in very poor health, Hans described the cello playing as the tone was thin and mostly out of tune, but I can remember every single phrasing. Now, when I went to the Schmidt symposium in Perchtoldsdorf in '86, there was an elderly gentleman who was probably older than Hans would have been by then, who remembered Schmidt from the same sessions, but probably a few years earlier, and just referred to him as the großartigste cellist den ich gekannt habe, the most splendid cellist I had ever heard. So I think probably Hans got him at a bad time, except that every phrasing was memorable. But by then the capacity to play the instrument had probably declined. It's a shame, because after all he was a stalwart of the Philharmonic for quite a long time in his early years.
So would you say that you had a shared passion for Franz Schmidt? Oh,
definitely, yes. But it didn't come about through Hans. It came about basically through that experience in Vienna.
You say in your book that he was a very positive person to work with. Could you say a little more about that?
Well, if you put up a programme idea, then unless it involved the Carl Nielsen Wind Quintet, for which he took a strange dislike, his automatic answer was yes, go ahead, do it, which is what a producer likes. I mean, his successor, Peter Gould, was very similar in that. But by then I'd had a lot longer there, and I think my ideas were much better organised. So Peter had less reason to say, "Oops, no, hold on, that doesn't work." He just said, "Fine, go ahead."
Would you say that you learned a lot from him then?
I think I probably did. I mean, I had a period when what I wrote was definitely a Hans Keller imitation, and I got through that one. In fact, when I did what he thought a particularly good piece for Radio Times, he sent me a congratulatory note, from which I took it that I had actually stopped trying to sound like a Hans Keller imitation, and that was way on.
Do you think his was a large impact on the BBC then overall?
For a while, but with what's happened to the BBC since, I mean, obviously not a lasting impact. but then perhaps there are no lasting impacts in broadcasting.
You say in your book that Hans had some problems with management, particularly in the 1970s. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I can probably tell you quite a lot about that. The management of the BBC had worked out a different structure for radio without telling anybody much that it was on the way. And when it became known that the idea was to scrap Home Service and Third and Music programme and replace them with Radio 3 and Radio 4, which would be respectively music orientated and speech orientated, it got a very bad reception with music producers who really valued the idea of recovery time, so that when your programme had gone out, it wasn't immediately followed by a different musical programme, but by something where you could use a different faculty. And the resistance was so intense that a group of 6 departmental heads worked in private. Hans wasn't a head, but he was near enough one, to organise resistance to the new system, which got nowhere. They met the management who would obdurate that this was the way to run music in the future. So then they organised a letter which 113 producers or 131 producers, you can check that, signed to the Times, thereby breaking their contract, which said that they were not in any circumstances to discuss the affairs of the corporation in public. And this letter went off, and the Times letter editor was amazed to get this from so many respected names, but published it, and we then left the director of radio, Ian Trethauwen, the problem of what to do about it. I must say I rather admire his solution, which was to write each person a letter saying, you have basically broken your contract, but in view of your remark in the letter that you will try to make the best programmes possible under the new flawed arrangement, I'd prefer to take no further action. So we won and we hadn't won. And Hans was an absolutely leading figure in that group of 6.
And was that something that you were directly involved with?
Yes, I signed a letter. And got the letter back from Ian Trethauwen. Wondered at its tact.
And your overall relationship with Hans Keller, did that go beyond the BBC?
Yes, it did slightly. In various respects. I did go with him to 1 or 2 football matches. This is something where I was followed by a very distinguished successor, Stephen Hurst, who also, despite his many disagreements with Hans about broadcasting, always accepted his offer to share the taxi to White Hart Lane if he possibly could. And I think that sums up the human contact between the two, which was always respectful, even when they loathed each other on doctrinal grounds. He encouraged me to write, and was quite critical when what I wrote either struck him as a bad imitation of himself, or just didn't come up to his standards in other ways, which was very good for me.
When was the last time that you saw Hans?
I didn't see him much in his retirement because he had motor neurone disease, so kept very much to himself. I can't actually remember the last time I saw him.
And aside from the 3 men we've already spoken about today, were there any other émigrés you came into contact with?
Well, there were 2 in my boyhood. One was Walter Gurr, father of Alexander, who was a fantastic conductor. We went to 1 or 2 of his concerts, even during the war. including one with a very early performance of Britten's Les Illuminations. I think I was bowled over by Walter's sheer vitality, which came over even in his piano score for the Monteverdi Coronation of Poppaea, which he asked me, or rather asked Dr. Kalmus to get me to do, because he remembered me from my boyhood and had a high opinion of my abilities. And the other one was Francesco Ticciati, whom I had much more to do with because he was a friend of the family, and I mean they both lived in Amersham, but Francesco was a wonderful pianist and a composer. He'd had a lot of success in the early 1920s at the Proms. I didn't even know then that he was a composer any more than I knew that Schmidt was a cellist. But he influenced my way of playing the piano, not because he taught me, but I learned from one of his pupils, but he had taught her well, and I grew up in a sort of Busoni tradition of fleetness and lightness, which can often take the form of playing things too fast, which I think I've often done, and getting faster once you've started. But he was just an amazing human being. Our nickname for him was Uncle Francesco. Francesco used to play for our friends and neighbours on Sunday night every week. I was too young. I was too young to be allowed to stay up, but my father did always make a note of what he'd played and drop it on my bed so that I could see it in the morning. I'd stayed awake as long as possible, but always dropped off finally. And those recitals and his practicing, because he used to practice for 3-4 hours a day at our house until the neighbour complained so bitterly that he had to move out. Those recitals impressed various pieces on my mind so that I could still almost play them nowadays if I could play the late Beethoven sonatas, certain Schubert impromptus, and so on and so forth. No, he was a great man and a great pianist.
Did either of them speak about their time before coming to Britain?
No. I knew that Walter had been in Schoenberg's composition class, master class in Berlin, and that he'd had to leave in 1933, presumably because he was Jewish. Also, I suspect that he was communist, but it was enough to be Jewish. Francesco didn't ever talk about life in Italy before the war, because he'd lived in this country since about 1920. So he'd only had his first 20-odd years in Italy. He never, as far as I know, dropped any disparaging remarks about Mussolini. I think politics just hardly figured in his inner world at all. I could be quite wrong about that, of course. He may just have decided it was something to keep very quiet about.
Did the fact that Francesco was a pianist have an impact on the fact that you became a piano player?
I think he probably did, yes. Well, I didn't become a professional pianist. I only ever became a talented amateur. But yes, he did.
And finally, in terms of émigrés in general, do you think that their experiences of persecution have had an impact on their relationship with music?
I think there is a connection, but it's a slightly broader connection than your question leaves room for. I suspect that it's now, as it always was, that there are a few absolutely outstanding people who are in the position rather of the founders of the great religions, whom can offer something like the truth, and the rest of the world is either not interested, or interested but not really understanding, or perhaps a few of them really understanding and doing something about it. And as I say, that may not have changed.
I think you end your book with a similar sentiment in the fact that some women and men had a great impact and cultural impact having come to this country, and other as just kind of went about their daily business.
Again, I do stress that I wonder whether any influence lasts indefinitely. I mean, from seeing things like the recent season of proms, I just wonder whether anything changed. The people who used to be sympathetic are still sympathetic, and a lot of the ones who've taken over from them are profoundly unsympathetic, which may just, of course, be ageism. But it happens to be what I feel, what I'm here to say.